There is a future for soils, and it's out there with the folks that are stacked up at this meeting and others that are working on things. I remember when I was chief of NRCS, and people and land grants were backing out of the soils program. They were shutting down the soils division, and you had fewer and fewer of those. And now, all of a sudden, soil and soil health is sexy. And that is a pretty nifty thing. Now, the same thing that occurred when I was chief of NRCS, and that was we started working on something we called Ecosystem Service Markets, trying to create value out of the ecosystem services that farmers and ranchers provide. We have been working on that for about 20 years, and it's had lots of fits and starts. And everything hasn't worked well. A lot of it has not. But we've got a newfound opportunity around these ecosystem markets today, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that with you right now. We've created something called the Ecosystem Service Market Consortium. And the mission of it tells it all to a group like this of soil health. Advance ecosystem service markets to incentivize farmers and ranchers to improve soil health systems that benefit society. Now, it's one thing to make that into a mission statement, but how do you get there? Well, in 2017, with the generous support of the Noble Research Institute, a series of convenings were held with hundreds of people coming together about how do you create value associated with soil health. The result of those convenings was in 2018, an ecosystem market strategic infrastructure was developed, and we started commissioning the work to be done in that. Now in 2019, we're actually at the point of having launched something that we're calling the Ecosystem Market Consortium to do the research, to do the outreach, to fill the gaps on how to connect soil health to an ecosystem market that connects willing buyers and willing sellers together to be able to do all of that. So, 2018, we commissioned the business plan, the economic market analysis. You heard about that last year, for those of you that were here. We made an application for an FFR grant that we're expecting any day now, and we began the outreach that's going on in the protocol development. We actually went from protocol development to protocol completion in 2018. Now, in 2019, the consortium has been created. It's up and running. We are piloting the very first one of these protocols. This is done again with the Noble Research Institute, a little tiny, tiny pilot in Texas and Oklahoma on only 50,000 acres. We're going to be able to do more in the future. As a matter of fact, over the next 3 years, I fully expect us to pilot in the neighborhood of 200 to 250,000 acres, such that when we go to commercialization of this ecosystem market in 2022, we will have done more acres in pilots, I believe, than all of the SIG grants on ecosystem markets for the last 15 or 20 years have been able to do combined. Gives you an idea of the kind of scale and the ambition that we're having to do. But you have to do this in scale and ambition because we're trying to rack up a lot of work. Now, already mentioned, there's a lot of lessons learned over the last 20 years on ecosystem markets. What have we learned from those? What have we changed? What have we modified? First, we did a supply and demand assessment. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but the supply and the demand are both significant. A tiered modular protocol, not one size fits all. We're going to be able to aggregate, disaggregate as the marketplace demands. We're going to talk about that in a bit. No additionality and permanence has been redefined. We ran into a problem in that the traditional carbon markets asked farmers to commit to 40 years or more in a contract. That didn't work. It also required that you had molecular permanence of carbon as opposed to system-wide permanence on carbon. That had to change. Folks said in the water markets, oh, well, if you take dollars from NRCS through EQIP, those aren't eligible. That had to change. Those are the lessons learned, and that's why we're going to be able to be successful in the future where it hadn't been in the past. The other thing is, a lot of other markets told farmers what to do. We think we can build this to be practice agnostic and outcomes based when you base it off the measurement of the soil health that's out there. Now, the primary market here is about greenhouse gases. Put simply, there is a voluntary market emerging on greenhouse gases because of corporate commitments to their shareholders and to their customers to reduce the footprint of greenhouse gases, and those all go into category 1, Scope 1, Scope 2, or Scope 3. To say it most simply, Scope 1 and Scope 2 for a company, say it's General Mills or Unilever or someone like that, that is what they can change inside their factory, inside their footprint. Scope 3 are all the things that impact their supply chain that they can't control, i.e., what happens on a farm or ranch. Those voluntary commitments are the target that we're going after in the creation of this ecosystem market for soil health. So what's the demand? We commissioned one of the best economic firms in the country to do what is the first time it's ever been attempted, and that is an ecosystem market assessment. What's the size of the prize? They estimate that it is nearly a $14 billion potential market. About half of it on the water quality side, half of it on the carbon side. Now, who's in the game with us? Who's joined this? We've got 21 members that we have announced publicly now. Well, I'm expecting another 7 or 8 in the next just few days as we go out on this. But you see Danone, General Mills, the Soil Health Institute, Nutrien, Sarah's here someplace, NIFWIF, Cargill, Bunge, Indigo, McDonald's, Noble Research Institute, TNC, ADM. These folks have made a major investment. They're founding circle members. We appreciate the support because they're saying, we think this can work. We've got another round of members coming in, legacy partners, Mars, Bayer, Tyson, the Soil Health Partnership, TFI, National Farmers Union, AFT, all willing to give us their expertise as well as invest some of their money in the concept of how do you create this market. Now, the real work is about to get started. Once the grant dollars start flowing, we're going to be dividing up into 4 or 5 research teams to really drill down on the research gaps that are out there. These teams, and I know this eye chart's tough to read, but quantification team, monitoring, reporting, verification, we have to drive down the cost of that, an MRBV platform, and a land ledger. This is how do you put the IT technology around it, and then quantifying those ecosystem service capacities. This is where this community can really step in. If you can channel with some of those partners to help us fill those research gaps, that's going to be vitally important because we've got to have every one of these research gaps filled in the next 2 years before we go into market. So, the protocols. Protocol, the first round's been developed. Now we're going to have to modify that for each and every area around the country. But it's really about quantifying, monitoring, reporting, verifying, and registering those farm and ranch-based ecosystem services. As we've designed this, it stacks up best to look at it this way. 2 tiers that can be aggregated or disaggregated. A buyer, if they want only carbon, is not going to want to buy the water credits. If a buyer wants the water credits, we're going to have to be able to do that. For those that are wanting the 2 combined, they'll come together. You can do water quality, you can do water quantity, and we're working through the logistics of each of those things. It's very fascinating because the carbon market, you've got established now today in California that you can market into. Water quality markets have been more elusive. They're very local, but they also have potential high-value dollars with those as they're moving forward. Now, we're moving into the pilot stage. We've got the first pilot going on today in the Southern Plains with Noble, but we're going to scale these out over the next several years with those partners that we've shown that are out there. And with that, we will expand the protocol. We will develop the protocol so that it works in the Corn Belt, works in the Pacific Northwest, so that it works on perennial crops, it works on annual crops, root crops, each of those things as though we go through that pilot stage. Now, where do you want to go with the pilots? Well, there's enough of us with a fondness for soil health. Our following of this will not be state-based. It will actually be land resource regions. And if you look at where we are today in Texas and Oklahoma, we basically are combining what to me is aquamarine and gray down there in the bottom into two land resource regions with a commonality that you can do range, pasture, and cropping systems. That's what we're currently piloting. Next pilot will be up in the Corn Belt. That's a fairly homogeneous land resource region. If we would go into the Great Plains next, the Northern Plains, you'd be combining those two green-based systems and do range and the crops that are there. The pilot chronology will be determined in the work groups associated with this. Once we launch those work groups and once we've got the funding on that, each of those decisions will be made in those respective work groups about, do you go to the west and do California, Washington, and Oregon next, or do you do the Great Plains, or do you do the Great Lakes? Each of those things will be decisions that shouldn't be made by consultants such as myself, but rather the participants in this process. With that, I've given you a high-level view of this Ecosystem Market Consortium. Talked to you a little bit about where we're going. Hope I've given you a little bit about what we intend to do. I'll try to fill in details one-on-one with anybody who wants to know more about what's actually in there and where we're going, but I'm also very conscious of the time frame that we're on and wanted to be very cognizant of that. So, any questions? Give me rapid-fire questions, or else I'm going to hand the podium back to Dr. Wayne Honeycutt.